There's no surprise today that modern-day geopolitical games are getting more and more complicated. If you look at the place where we're living right now, either the politicians are very much interested in regaining the political positions across the spectrum. On the other hand, citizens around the world are very much concerned about this economic agenda. Again, we're living in a rather complicated and sophisticated world today. How do we understand everything that happened lately? Now, make no mistake, if you follow our show, we've been talking about what happened in the past, especially from the historical perspective. Remember the period that we talk about the civilizations and also all those historical icons? What can we learn from those people? And also, how about the lessons that we drew from the past and perhaps have direct impact about what's happening today? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Mr. Johan Norberg. Mr. Norberg is an author and a lecturer and a documentary filmmaker. He was born in Sweden. He received his MA in the History of Ideas from the University of Stockholm, and he's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., and he's the author of this amazing book called Peak Human: What We Can Learn from History's Greatest Civilizations. Well, Mr. Norberg, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, sir, it's such an honor to have you on our show. Again, as we mentioned before, there's no surprise that modern-day geopolitics are rather complicated. But what fascinated me about your book, it's at the beginning you started to mention the phrase, it's called the Golden Age. I want to read something to you, and I want to get your further elaboration. This is what you wrote, and I quote, "A golden age is associated with a culture of optimism, which encourages people to explore new knowledge, experiment with new methods and technologies, and exchange the result with others." End quote. Mr. Norberg, how should we understand the phrase of golden age, and why is that relevant, especially when we talk about the progress or this tremendous development of civilization? Let's start from there. Your thoughts.
Yeah, we often talk about golden ages, something exciting that happened in the past, and hopefully we can draw some lessons from what they experienced back then. To me, I'm not associating this with any kind of territorial expansion, just the fact that they used force in a efficient way and managed to subdue other populations. What made a real golden age golden was the fact that they managed to create a dynamic, flourishing, thriving civilization for people living there, at least compared to their contemporaries. So they created, out of scientific curiosity, technological and economic innovation, living standards that were higher than it was amongst their neighbors. And they managed to keep that going for quite some time. And since that is a rare thing in human history, it's worth looking at what they got right.
Mr. Norberg, when we talk about civilization, again, it was crucial part of the history. I mean, regardless which angle that we are standing at, but also at the beginning of the introduction, fascinatingly, that you talk about something you called civilization's worst enemy. So in other words, that's something that I have to say, before reading your book, quite frankly, never came to my mind. And I believe that to a lot of readers, and also the people who are listening to the podcast, that's something that, again, is quite new to us. And the answer, that not by you, but by art historian, it says, first of all fear of war, fear of invasion, fear of plague and famine. I mean, we look at what's happening today around the world. I'm sorry to say that countries are actually living in the midst of the war. Countries are actually undergoing this tremendous famine. Of course, I mean, there's no denying the fear factor continue resonant with a lot of international audience. So going back to your book, what is the connection between the fear of the civilization? So in other words, how can we draw the lessons, or how can we understand or interpret the word fear when we talk about the progress of the civilization, or even, I dare to say, the milestones from the civilizations? Your thoughts?
Yeah, the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, he talked about two different mindsets that to him explained where civilization was going. One was the Athenian mindset of going out into the unknown to learn something new and acquire something new. And that's how you build something continuously novel, innovative, dynamic. But the other one was the more Spartan attitude, staying at home to protect what you have already got. And one obvious conclusion from history is that you do the first thing. You're more of an Athenian when you have a cultural self-confidence. When you think that you might succeed, there's opportunity out there waiting for you. But once you become afraid, once you become terrified by the world, pandemics or geopolitical tensions or social media just scaring the living daylights out of you, you tend to stay at home because it's dangerous out there. And I absolutely agree with you. Right now, we are in a very fearful mindset. Sometimes that's related to very real concerns about the world. But the problem with this fear is that it sometimes leads us to becoming counterproductively protectionist in our attitude, because if we try to protect ourselves by building walls and tariff barriers and electing strongmen to protect us against all those threats, we might lose much of that, those new ideas, new trade opportunities, economic growth that could have helped us to deal with these problems. And that's one of the things that I'm most afraid of right now.
I know, Mr. Norberg, in your book, again, you specifically used different civilizations to understand, or help us to understand, that what's happening today. And especially, I want to talk about, again, one of the largest countries in the world today, which is China. But specifically, you pick the Song Dynasty. I mean, I am no historian, but I know that when we talk about the Song Dynasties, two words came to my mind. And number one, politics. It was all about politics. It was so messy, it was rather complicated. And the second thing, it was the word agriculture, food. So, to our audience, to our viewers, Mr. Norberg, why did you specifically to talk about Song Dynasty? I mean, again, we're looking at the country that 1.3 billion people, economically hungry, politically desirable, and recently, again, we're looking at this ongoing political economic tension between US and China. But looking back to history, if I dare to say that the transformation of China, or the transformation of any dynasties, could actually teach modern day China so much more. But again, going back to my question, why Song Dynasty? What is the correlation of the civilization to the Song Dynasty? What are you trying to make right there?
Yeah, it's obvious that China 1,000 years ago was ahead of every other civilization in a spectacular way when it comes to science, when it comes to technology, when it comes to the economic progress it was making. And there are many starting points. There are many interesting episodes in China's history that I could look at. But it is obvious that during the Song dynasty, roughly 10th to 13th century, this was the period when its superiority, its preeminence against the rest of the world was greater than ever before. James Needham, who devoted his whole life to studying the history of technology in China, said, whenever one follows up a particular piece of scientific or technological history, for some reason or other, you always end up in the Song dynasty. And the reason why was that this was a period when they constantly explored and tested and experimented with new ideas in agriculture, for example, with new crop, with new strains of rice and tea, and but also in the broader economy. The rural areas were commercialized with paper money, and dramatic urbanization was going on, which in its turn led to specialization and very impressive industry in the enormous cities. While London and Paris might have had some 20,000 people at most, these were perhaps a million people cities in China at this time. And some economic historians say that when they look at the production of iron and steel and of textile machines, it seemed like China was on its way to create an industrial revolution 400 years before it started in Britain. So it's a decent starting point if you think of why China made such rapid progress. And this was also the period in time when it paid off for the Chinese to do that, because it, relative to many other dynasties, it was a period of private property rights, freedom of exchange, where it was you were allowed to experiment with new ideas and allowed to reap the rewards and keep the benefits of the fruits of your labor. So compared to many other eras in Chinese history, the Chinese were free to explore and experiment, and then they did.
Well, but I want to dive a little bit deeper in this chapter. Again, I spend a good amount of time reading about the Song Dynasty. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, that during the Song Dynasty, that people, especially we're talking about the owners, that who possessed so much, regardless land, regardless wealth, those people actually were given the privileges to hold political offices or even to serve in the government. But today we're looking at this complete 180-degree turnover. But I'm trying to say is I'm trying to understand how the wealth played a role in the Chinese history during the Song Dynasty. But today, when we look at the political power, regardless in China or in the US or anywhere else, it's no longer about money. It's about something else. It's about the amplification of the message. It's about the connection with the people. It's about the rhetoric resonate with the voters, or however you want to put it. So again, Mr. Norberg, from your perspective, can you help us to understand, back in the days, back in the Song Dynasty, what role was the politics? And also, how did the economy actually play a factor compare with what's happening right now? As I mentioned before, money is one thing, but money, it's not everything. Your thoughts?
No, that's absolutely right. It's something, but it's not everything. I think that partly by accident, the Song dynasty became such a commercialized society where wealthy entrepreneurs, merchants, landowners became wealthy, partly because the old feudal system was breaking down. Once upon a time, you basically just took taxes in kind, the products of people, and then you often, certain things followed from this. You often had to force people to stay where they were, because that's how they could produce the taxes that you wanted, and you often, a semi-feudal system is quite common, where you give the militaries control over the land. It was difficult to uphold this after periods of civil strife and civil war. So instead, what the Song dynasty did was that they said that, okay, instead we'll just try to fund the military and the government from taxes on commercial activity and on production, which gave them an incentive to encourage more of that. So they began to encourage mobility, commerce, and trade to an extent that had been unusual until then, which meant that those who were most successful in these commercial ventures, while sometimes this was controversial, they also received a lot of status and also clout in culture and in politics to an extent that was unusual in other places. So this is a way when rich people got a lot of power, but at the same time they were exposed to competition. So they weren't allowed to sort of just keep their old traditional monopolies safe in most instances. They had to be innovative all the time, compared to many other episodes in China and in other places where in the end the rulers call the shots. And if they begin to think that this is an area of commerce that we enjoy, they might just steal it, they might monopolize it, they might control it, and they might take the fruits of that labor.
Well, Mr. Norberg, I have two more questions before letting you go. Let's go back to another crucial period of civilization, which Athens. We know that when we talk about Athens, it's beyond Aristotle, it's beyond Socrates. And also, you dedicate good amount of the content on Athens. But again, I want to read something to you, and let's get deeper. This is what you wrote, and I quote, "This individualism was reinforced by another strange custom. Many Greeks became independent property-owning farmers rather than serfs and subjects. We don't know exactly how this came about, but it happened after the Late Bronze Age collapsed around 1200 BC, end quote. I think when we talk about Athens, when we talk about that period, individualism versus collectivism is still something resonates with our audience today. But back in the days, when we look at the history, look at the civilization, the definition of individualism, again, it's not the same as what we talk about today. The collectivism is no longer interpreted as tribalism, as people build communities. It's more about characteristic distinction. But go back to what I read before, Ms. Norberg, how significant was the concept of individualism when you research or when you study Athens? And how does that relate to civilization during that period? So in other words, was that a big thing on the agenda, or that was something that people gradually or procedurally understand to say, hey, I can actually have independent thinking, not as a tribalism partner or tribalism member? Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. They didn't use the concept of individualism to this extent. It was something that didn't take place suddenly with a commandments from God or from rulers or from a manifesto, but it happened gradually as people got more freedoms. Since farmers acquired more secure property rights to their plots, which they could pass on to their children, it gave them an interest in developing the land, in thinking of what their own choices on what to grow and how to do it and how to protect this from others. And step by step, there emerged a sort of self-consciousness in this class where they began to think of themselves as important people who had something unique to contribute. And according to some theories, these were the ones who also made up then the bulk of the Athenian military and of many other Greek city-states. They were sort of independent, self-owning farmers who also some sort of middle class, who also doubled as infantry soldiers. And that, in turn, when they combined this, the property rights, they were creating wealth, they're making their own decisions on the market, and they also had a specific peculiar role as the ones who defended the city-state, it also meant that they began to demand a say in politics, in crucial decisions. So we don't really know how this happened, if it emerged step by step or if it happened through certain revolutions. They just told the ruler that, no, we want a say. And eventually in Athens, of course, this developed into a democracy of sorts, even though women and slaves were excluded. In other Greek city-states, this resulted in certain classes of a broader middle class at least being allowed to have a say in government. So here suddenly you see 2,500 years before our time, how certain individualism, certain checks and balances of the arbitrary rule of governments were developed through an emerging individualist mindset.
I'm very glad that you mentioned the word democracy. Take US, for example. I mean, again, there's no denying that we're seeing this political polarization. You know, we can trace it all the way back to the first election, 2016, a presidential election of Donald Trump. And then we transition to Joe Biden period, you know, this Biden economics. And then 2024, 2025, we're seeing Donald Trump right now is the second term. And tragically speaking, recently what happened to Charlie Kirk. I mean, this the voice of the conservative youth was sadly assassinated. But when I look at the media, again, going back to the word individualism, going back to collectivism, as I mentioned before, it's no longer to say that individual has the freedom to speak the mind, or individual has the liberty to express the opinion. But instead, it's more about this collective voices influenced individual ideas or thoughts gradually. I tend to use one example to say it's not blind can lead the blind, but it's actually the blind can sometimes fool the ones who can actually see. So again, Mr. Norberg, from your perspective, again, I want to talk a little bit more before asking the last question is, how should we understand the complication of the political system today? It's not just the US, it's not just the China, it's not just about France or Germany, but again, are we seeing more tendencies towards collective ideas or collective thoughts, or we should definitely allow individualistic thoughts and collective thoughts run together within the same or under the same framework? Your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a very complex subject on which we can learn a lot from history, I think. We can learn, one thing is that a certain degree of partisanship and contrary points of view being expressed is a good thing, because it means that we have more ideas on the table and there's a smaller risk that we miss something important if people who don't agree with us are free to speak their minds. But obviously, if that partisanship becomes so radicalized and so that you don't never ever listen to the other side, but only to people who are the most radical advocates of your point of view, we don't get more ideas on the table. We have a risk of sort of narrowing our perspective on the world. And I think that there's something going on in politics that's not really suited to a broad and complex conversation of different points of view. And what do I mean by that? I mean this. We are more diverse than we've ever been. We have more different lifestyles, experiences, opportunities than ever before. We can read all these different books and read anything on social media, which means that we lead relatively different lives. There's no way of putting that back into the box. The problem is that we both have a sort of progressive illiberal left and a conservative populist right who think that the solution is to force everybody onto the same script, to force everybody into one particular lifestyle. You are forced to sort of basically lead the traditionalist, conservative American lifestyle, or you're forced to sort of bake the cake for gay weddings. Otherwise, your government will force you to do that anyway. So, and the problem is you might preach unity when you do that, but what you get is eternal conflict between all these different groups. And I think that as long as they keep this perspective that there's one solution and one only to every answer, we will see these attacks on the other side in a very ugly, radical way, because it's, to many, it's seen as we will win or we will lose completely. There's no live and let live perspective anymore. So I think both sides would have to update their perspectives to a more modern, broad, globalized world than we've had. I think this is worse in America for one reason, and that's because it's a two-party system, and it's governed by the most radical elements of both sides often, which means that I don't think most people like this. In fact, if you look at the polls, there's an exhausted majority who would want something completely different. But both parties are dragged by their radical wings into very peculiar positions. And then, since most people tune out, the only way in which they get the attention is to demonize the other side and say they are here to destroy your lifestyle. As long as that goes on, American politics will be ugly indeed.
My God, I just wish that every single politician in the US can really understand or just sit down, listen to what you just said. Because that makes so much sense about what I just saw in the morning and also the conversation I had with people from both sides. Well, Mr. Norberg, I want to wrap up our conversation, briefly ask you the last question. Again, it's an amazing book. It's a wonderful book for us to understand the civilization happened in the past and also what's happening today. Again, the book is called Peak Human, What We Can Learn from History's Greatest Civilization. There you go, that's the book. Final thoughts. What would you expect the readers to understand today, especially today, when we look at the complication of the political games, uncertainty of the modern day economy, and also, most importantly, how do we encourage the younger generations to make up their minds towards the righteous way and not to be influenced by the biased opinions? Your final thoughts.
I think that the lesson from history is quite loud. It says that if you want a dynamic, thriving society which grows and creates opportunities for more people, you have to have a certain degree of tolerance for the unpredictable and the uncertain, because most of the great solutions, progress in culture and technology in the economy comes from the unknown. It comes from the surprises. It comes from the experiments of lots of people and their experiments, their trial and error, constant adaptation. And that doesn't guarantee that we'll get the best results, but it creates a platform, a network, which gives us greater opportunity to stand a greater chance of succeeding than if we fall for the eternal temptation of handing power to people who say that they have the solutions to every one of our problems, because that is just a way of substituting this collective wisdom of millions of people looking at the world from their vantage point, their individual creativity and local knowledge. Substitute all of that with just the preferences of a few people at the top. It always sounds tempting. It always sounds great when someone promises us false security and predictability, but it's a way of losing that spark that makes civilizations creative. And that's the message, I think, for the future. We have to keep that going. One reason why I looked at civilization's golden eras in many different places, different continents, eras, is to show an important point. And that's the fact that it can appear anywhere, but is not guaranteed anywhere. So, for example, the Abbasid caliphate in the 9th century, which was the sort of the Arab world, which was by then the most scientifically advanced. And one region included was Central Asia and Afghanistan. Today, Afghanistan is one of the least developed countries and run by an authoritarian system that really deprives their people of all opportunities. The fact that such a culture was one of the leading civilizations once upon a time tells us two things. It tells us that curiosity, innovation, and progress is possible anywhere. It's more a mindset and a choice than a fate. But the other conclusion is it's not guaranteed anywhere. The simple fact that you once had it doesn't mean that you can't lose it, because that might happen if you make the wrong choices for the future.
Well, indeed, Mr. Norberg, I mean, as the cliche goes, if something looks good on the paper, but that doesn't mean it will work in reality. I mean, words have power, but in reality, we really need to see the action instead of just listening to the noises. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's great honor to speak to Mr. Johan Norberg. Again, he's an author and a lecturer and a documentary filmmaker. I strongly encourage everyone go online and check out this amazing book. It's called Peak Human: What We Can Learn from History's Greatest Civilizations. Well, Mr. Norberg, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We love to have you back on the show as we continue to discuss your book and, of course, about the modern day affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.
Pleasure was all mine. Thank you very much.